wonder I haven't lost it in the last 3 weeks. But this actually is my bad leg. This used to be my bad leg. Now this is my bad leg. But anyway, I'm recovering. It's been a wonderfully successful surgery, and I'm happy to be here. A little bit about me, just so you know, my background. Ron said, geez, it was strange to go from insurance to utility. I actually went from utility to insurance. And then I went back to utility. So I'm not sure which move was the worst. But before that, I spent 5 years teaching college up in Detroit. You know, back when that was a great place to live. And Michigan is still an absolutely beautiful state to live in. And I visit there every summer for a month and appreciate green and what lakes really look like, and find it very enjoyable. Come back all rejuvenated. And I'm looking forward to that on July 22nd or something like that. But many years ago, before all of you were born, I got my PhD from the University of Wisconsin. Taught college for 4 or 5 years. Found out it was lousy at publishing, and that while I had a good shot at tenure, it was probably not going to happen. And at the same time, somebody offered me a job at a bank, and I went to work for a bank, National Bank of Detroit. I discovered that I just didn't fit in with banking. It was too structured and too much kiss ass. I didn't say that, but that was way back. Different than banks are today. Honest to God, you know, they just sat back and printed their money. One of my students got me an interview over at the local utility gas company that was going to try to diversify and become an unregulated company. I was vice president and treasurer of that company fast, and I would have made vice president at the bank. And you know that most everybody at the bank is the vice president. So it worked out pretty well for me, and I thought I had it made, working for a company I could live with for the rest of my life. When some guy named Oscar Wyatt, who worked out of Houston, you guys probably never heard of him either, but he used to be the terror of Houston, made an unsolicited cash tender offer, and I discovered that there is no defense for an unsolicited cash tender offer. If he offers enough money, you're gone. So we were a natural gas pipeline, diversified into trucking, distribution, exploration and production, and coal. And the next day we were a subsidiary of the Coastal Corporation in Houston. And I was unemployed. Even though I'd been vice president and treasurer of the company, they didn't need 2 vice president and treasurers. I wrote letters to 300 or 400 of my closest friends. One of them I wrote to a guy named General McDermott at USAA, who I actually had been the dean of the Air Force Academy when I graduated 50 years ago. And McD hired me. Went down to USAA. A year later, I was made vice president, senior vice president and treasurer of USAA, and thought that, again, I had a company that I could work for the rest of my life. But 10 years later, somebody knocked on my door. I went from there to Entergy Corporation in New Orleans, electric utility company with about $20 billion in assets, back when that was big, 1995, 96. Spent 5 years there. It was a tough situation because I got there and I was hired by the chairman and the vice and the CFO to help them solve their problem. I'm a quick study. 3 weeks after I got there, I had figured out their problem. It was the chairman and the CFO. Recognizing that, I said, I got to do something with this. And I got a chance to go out to California because they were going to do this thing called deregulation of the electric industry. And I spent 8 years out there going through agony, high-risk situations, and learning an awful lot. And I'm going to spend most of my time on that tonight, and I've already taken my hour and 15 minutes, and I'm now down to an hour, so I'm going to have to go fast. The first thing I did when I got into business, and I don't know why I did this as opposed to finances, I just felt I wanted to deal with real product. Whether it was gas, whether it was making loans, whether it was insurance, I felt more comfortable on the product side than on the financing side, or the security side. So that's where I wound up. But one of the big things I learned right from the start was the importance of risk and risk management. And in 1965, when I started, 67, when I started grad school, nobody even cared about risk management. Nobody really knew what it was. Cost of capital was a weighted average cost of capital. Nobody worried about what happens if things went wrong. But by the time a few things happened, people said, hey, how do we manage for that? How do we account for that? And I became more and more convinced that risk management was the key to creating value. whether you're looking at value and trying to identify value from the stock side or the security side, or you're looking at the assets that you're putting into play and putting into making investment in, it's making them valuable. Increasing their value is the key. That's how stock prices go up. And just to give you a simple idea, let's assume you've got an annuity of $10 out to infinity, an annual payment of $10 out to infinity, and your discount rate is 10%. What's the value of that? $100. Simple enough. How do you increase its value? We've got a security now, an annuity that's worth $100. I wonder I'm managing it. What can I do to increase its value? It's a simple annuity, a simple state. There's only two ways to do it. What are they? Increase what? Increase the numerator. Yeah. So I go from $10 to $11. And a 10% increase. Now, if you're running a company and you want to increase your cash flow from $10 to $11, a 10% increase, that could be a challenge. Hopefully management's already gotten the maximum cash flow possible. But that's the issue. How else can I increase that value? Decrease the discount rate. If I decrease the discount rate by 10%, I also get an increase in value, which is easy to do. Why does the discount rate go down? What's going to drive that? We know what cash flow is. That's what's going to have to increase. But what's going to drive that discount rate down? What does that discount rate represent? Risk. Time value of money and risk. And risk is as it's perceived. Is it easy to increase the $10 from 10 to 11? Or the discount rate from 10 to 9? You've got, as a corporate manager, it's how the company is perceived. If you can get the investing public to see less risk because you form them better, you manage the company better, you can probably create value as good or better by managing risk as it's perceived than you can by increasing cash flow. Because not that increasing cash flow is good, it's great, but it's probably more difficult to do. So risk management is a key way to increase value. Now on the screen up there, I've got the normal curve. I know you've all seen the normal curve, you use it. Hey, what's risk? Is events that are coming one at a time, two at a time, three at a time. We try to fit them in the normal curve. You know, the good and bad. The bad things that happen are typically on the left side, risk. Good things that happen on the right side, that's opportunity. And we look at the tails and we say, hey, the really bad things are 1, 2 standard deviations out. So in that normal curve, between one standard deviation out, we've got, what, 65% of the possible events. 2 standard deviations out, we've got, or 1.96 standard deviations out, we've got 95% of the possible events. 2 standard deviations, we've got 99%. But when we're looking at possible occurrences of things, we've only got 1 or 2 events to measure. And is our curve, represented by mean and variance, midpoint and standard deviation, a good representation of what the risk is? I don't know. How do I turn this down one? There we go. If the variance is the first movement around the mean. I'm not quite sure why they call that, but it's just if you go to the second moment around the mean, you calculate something called skewness. And that's a long tail. Here I've got skewness drawn with a long tail to the left. You have 2, 3, 4, 5 observations. You assume you have a normal curve, well balanced, when in fact your selection may have been, or the next event that's going to occur might be from a skewed distribution and you don't even know it. Same mean, same variance, but there's a lot more negatives lot more events to the negative or left side than there is to the right side. You don't know that. That's risk. You go to the next moment, that's the second moment. Go to the third moment, and you get something that Wikipedia, that's called kurtosis, or peakedness. Look at the peak. The mean is the same, the standard deviation is the same. We got this big peak. And in order to keep the mean and standard deviation the same, the mathematics is you've got to have big tails. Look at that tail up there. What's in those tails? Standard deviation hasn't changed. You've got some events out there with high probability, maybe 2, 3, 4%, that are 4, 5, 6 standard deviations away. What's in them? Things like Exxon Valdez, the Fukushima nuclear plant problem 3 years ago, General Motors ignition switch, all sorts of things. Jamie Dimon's great whale, that almost put him under 18 or 19 months ago. These are the events that nobody really knows about, but they can put a company under. Nobody expects them to happen. They don't fit into a normal curve, but they fit into the big tails. Black swans, those unique events become very, very difficult to predict, but can do a company under. One of my problems is I get caught away from my notes, and then I got to go back and figure out where the heck I am. So put up with me for a moment. Yeah, we've had 3 nuclear meltdowns in the last 30 years. They don't fit into probability distributions. Exxon Valdez, we've got black swans. MF Global, just because he could run Goldman Sachs, and he wasn't very good at running the state of New Jersey, but John What's-His-Face thought he could run, what was his last name, Ron? The guy? Corsi, thank you. John Corsi thought he could make MF Global into the next Goldman Sachs. He almost killed the company. He did kill the company, and he may go to jail for it. We've got these things. I know Ron has talked about long-term capital management. The guys who are running long-term capital management were 5 or 6 of the biggest, brainiest guys out of Solomon Brothers that the world had ever seen. And they made one bad bet, and they lost the company. They thought that Russian bonds would move with U.S. interest rates, and it didn't. But you've got to look for these things. One of the scary things about this is, while the tidal waves and black swans may be natural events, a lot of these other events are people-caused. That's why I stuck that first reading in there, just that realize that many of the risks that we have are people-related. But the good news is just as many times the solution is people-related. The solution isn't necessarily eliminating the risk beforehand, but it's preparing for it, or mitigating the risk, or being able to respond to it effectively and logically. But these risks we have to be prepared for. Some of them take the form of security risks, some of them take the form of companies, operational risks. But I have taken the approach that we have to isolate these things, be prepared for them, and be able to respond. That's effective risk management in an operational point of view, effective risk management from a financial point of view. But it's hard to summarize them in a curve like this, because we just don't know. It's all one event, single event, 2 events, 3 events. They don't fit into a normal curve. It's hard to figure them out. But also want to spend a moment talking about risk and return. You have to have risk. You have to be willing to bear risk in order to get a return, to create value. But just because you're bearing risk does not mean you have a right to value, or a right to net income, or a right to return. You're all familiar with the capital asset pricing model, right? Random, systematic risk and random risk. Does random risk warrant any return at all? Why not?
You can't value it.
You can eliminate it. If you can eliminate the risk, why should it earn return? So if you're bearing risk, you've got to make sure that associated with that risk is return, or at least, or alternatively, the creation of value. If it's random risk, you're probably looking at a zero-sum game. Does that mean there's no benefit to it? No. On the contrary, there can very well be. But if it's a zero-sum game, there's no value created. How does the understanding of that type of risk become important. How many people here go to Vegas or go to the casinos or whatever? Do you expect to have a system that's going to beat them? You go, you get some entertainment, so maybe you're getting creating value there. But you're not. I mean, it's a zero-sum game. As a matter of fact, it's a negative-sum game. But you go do it. Is there any other negative-sum game, or at least zero-sum game, that I imagine 95% of you people here participate in?
Lottery.
The lottery, yeah. That's a lot worse than a negative-sum game. Any other negative-sum that actually creates value? Now, there's a contradiction. Negative-sum game that creates value. Think back to that. Reduce the risk, right? What negative-sum game do you participate that reduces risk? How many people drove here tonight? Do you have insurance? Negative-sum game. But it's risk reduction, right? The risk reduction is worth the value of the fact that you're out of money. It's a zero-sum game, but you feel a lot better, and you don't go to jail. So that zero-sum game actually creates value because you're exchanging risks. You take a little risk, you give up real money, the insurance company takes on the big risk in terms of but they can diversify and eliminate the risk. So there is a benefit, and you can create value with effective risk management. Now, I'm going to jump ahead to another topic, and then we'll try to tie this back a little bit. As Ryan introduced it, I want to talk about the California energy crisis. Most of you here were in third grade when that occurred, 1999 through about 2002, 2003. But I moved from Energy Corporation to the California Independent System Operators. Anybody ever heard of Texas ERCOT? Nobody's heard of ERCOT. It's the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, and they run all of the distribution and electric transmission in the state of Texas. The California ISO does the same thing, still does the same thing very successfully out in California, which continues to pride itself on being the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. They're not part of the union, so they don't have to. They're okay to say that. I didn't leave California, I escaped, in case you wonder. But California decided that they wanted to deregulate electricity. They did it because the federal government basically opened the door and almost pushed them through. The federal government and some other academics had just looked at some major industries and decided that deregulation or the lessening of regulation was the way to go to create value for the consumer and for the companies. The first major deregulation was, I think, the airlines in the 70s. What happened? Well, airlines went bankrupt, and they continue to do that. We had some airlines shut down. We had services restricted. We also found rates getting very, very competitive. I can tell you this, in the environment we were in 1970, if you wanted to fly from California to New York, it probably would have cost you, in today's dollars, $700, $800, $900, not $99 or $89 or $120. And there would never be any such thing as a sale. So the deregulation of the airlines created value, created opportunity. In 1981, 82, 83, and I think the final culmination was 1983 or 84, it was ruled that they could break up AT&T, which then held all of the Bell operating companies all across the country that controlled both long distance and local telephone. And people said, what's going to happen? My God, we'll lose all the quality of service, lose dependable service. And they did it, and we went through a period for about 5, 6, 10 years where we had strong competition on long distance service. MCI, AT&T, all the baby bells that were split up were all providing competition. And lo and behold, what does it cost us now for long distance service?
We don't know what it is.
Yeah, it used to cost like $5 a minute to call New York to California, 30, 40 years ago. It doesn't cost anything. You pay a $40 fee to AT&T, the new AT&T, which is formerly Southwest Bell. And you make all the long distance and perhaps international calls you want to make in a day. And just nonstop. Doesn't cost anything. And we're doing it on a cell phone, not a dial rotary. So deregulation worked tremendously there too. And then they said, well, let's deregulate electricity. Because those guys are making so much money, and it's actually guaranteed because it's heavily regulated. We need these guys to build plants, and we want them, and we'll guarantee them a rate of return. But let's deregulate and see what happens. Make it competitive. Well, the order to get competitive came from the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington. And the way they did it was they couldn't control local distribution companies like CPS or Texas Utilities. They couldn't control generation plants. Those were all under the state. But what they did control was all the transmission lines. Because under Supreme Court order, or recognition, that transmission lines were viewed to be interstate commerce. And because they were interstate commerce, they were under the federal government. And the federal government required that every company, and basically you had what they called vertically integrated utility, electric companies that had plants, electric plants, transmission lines, and distribution, and build you. They made their own electricity, delivered it to your house, and build you. That the transmission lines became common carriers. Every company with a transmission line had to publish a rate. And if somebody else wanted to come in and try to sell electricity at the home, they could do it. And what would happen is that they could use the transmission lines and the distribution lines to deliver the electricity. And the utility that owned the lines, the wires, would get a fee, but they would lose the profit on the electricity. People said, well, let's see how this will work. And the FERC ordered it to happen, or enabled it to happen. They didn't order it. And a couple of states in the East Coast decided to do it. And California in 1998 said, let's do it. Actually, they passed a law in 1996 that says, we're going to deregulate electricity. How are we going to do that? Well, let's get the most brilliant guys we can, put them in a room, lock them up, and don't let them out until they've come up with the best ideas. But unfortunately, they should have thrown the keys away, but they didn't. And the academics and the intelligentsia came out with a model for deregulating electricity in California that theoretically looked wonderful. The decision was, let me show you California. California electricity was basically centered around three main cities and three main publicly held companies. ISOs or IOUs, investor-owned utilities. In the San Francisco area was Pacific Gas and Electric, a subsidiary of PG&E Company, which was a worldwide energy company. In the Los Angeles area, it was SoCal Edison, Southern California Edison, a subsidiary of Edison International. In the San Diego area, it was San Diego Gas and Electric, which was a subsidiary of Sempra. It had a different name back then. Sempra is the holding company, again, a global energy company. They held the three distribution companies that handled basically 60 to 70% of the population of California. The other two main sources of support were the two public companies, a la CPS, publicly owned companies. Los Angeles Water and Power, which was owned by the city of Los Angeles, and Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which is owned by Sacramento. Between those two companies and the three utilities, three IOUs, you had 80% of the electricity consumed in the state. And the deregulation was going to be concentrated on the three main IOUs, the privately held public utilities, stockholder held. Unfortunately, if you look at that diagram, most of their power and most of their transmission lines were radial structured, pointing into the cities. there was very little transmission lines connecting them. That didn't bother the brains that made up the idea of how to deregulate. But it was very difficult to get power from one metropolitan area to another, even from Los Angeles to San Diego. There were 3 nuclear plants at that point in time. One on just north of Los Angeles, which is San Onofre. I think that is now closed down. One south of Los Angeles, and then one just over the border in Arizona that supplied California. And then there were innumerable gas, diesel-powered, not too many diesel, innumerable natural gas and a few coal plants throughout the state. And then up in the north and the northwest, a lot of water power, a lot of hydro. And the brilliant guy said, here's the way we're going to do it. We are going to, each of the 3 IOUs, PG&E, SoCal Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric, will sell off all of their fossil plants, all their coal and natural gas plants, to the highest bidder. Hopefully they'll make some money. They've already got a lot of money invested in nuclear, and to the extent that this becomes what was called a stranded investment, that they're underwater on that investment, or that they don't get all their money back on the plants they sell off, we will guarantee that rates are going to be fixed until they recover all of their costs. And then we'll allow the rates to float. And then, because prices will go down, because these power plants will be bought by competitive companies, and they'll be trying to cut rates and undercut everybody else, prices will go down. And everybody benefits. The 3 companies, 3 IOUs will still make money, and all of the customers and consumer citizens of California will have reduced rates. Sounds wonderful. And it really sounded great, but we were in La La Land. The next step was, how are we going to price electricity? One way to do it would be to encourage each of the 3 IOUs to go out and sign long-term contracts with suppliers. After they sold off their plants, they would sign a contract with somebody and say, hey, I'll buy all your output for the next 5 years at so much, or you'll deliver so many megawatts a day for 5 years or 3 years, and here's the price I'll pay. What's that? That's risk management. That's knowing what your costs are going to be. Unfortunately, the contract you sign might be too high a price, because prices might go below that. Who's going to look bad then? Can't hear you. No, the guys who look bad will be the politicians that forced design people. So they didn't want to sign long-term contracts. Because if it turned out long-term contracts were better than the spot market, they'd look bad for maybe people buying the spot market. If it turned out that long-term contracts were higher than the spot market, it would make the politicians look bad because it cost money there. So they said, no, we're going to sell everything on the spot market. And they set up a company called the California Power Exchange. And the California Power Exchange was set up to buy and sell power as an agent, like the New York Stock Exchange does, but not as a principal, on a day-ahead basis, and also on a day-of basis. It's sort of a clearinghouse. Everybody would send prices, would send in what their expectations were, and they would match supply and demand, just like the New York Stock Exchange does. However, the New York Stock Exchange operates on a ladder basis. It clears the bottom offers, and then the next up offers, and the next up offers. They decided to use a pool concept. And the way that worked is, if the IOUs said we need to have 300 million megawatts hours at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then the lowest prices to provide those megawatt hours at 1 o'clock in the afternoon the next day would be selected, and they would all get not the price they bid in, but the clearing price, as opposed to the price they bid. So there was a reason to bid in low, because you'd know you'd get yours sold, but you'd probably get a higher price. This clearing price concept, as opposed to everybody gets the price they bid in, was subject to a lot of discussion. And if you do some research on it, you should conclude that it doesn't really matter. But nevertheless, this presented problems too. The California ISO, Independent System Operator, was then set up to manage the transmission system, the getting the power from the plant to the customer.